Today's topic is requirements engineering, and here also we are going to discuss about an engineering process, right? First of all, we have to think of what we mean by requirement. A requirement means a functional specification of a system or a service, right? Usually, when you design a system, it can be a kind of service, and we simply say it's a system. So, all the functional things which should involve within your system can be taken as requirements, right? So, in this requirement can be taken as two kinds of requirements. One type is user requirement. User requirement, and the other type is system requirement. When we talk about these user requirements, these user requirements are considered according to the user's perspective. User means the person who are going to use this system. Simply say this user will be the customer, right? So these requirements are considered in considered according to the user's perspective, and these system requirements are considered according to the developer's perspective. So here in users requirement, these users requirements are written in an understandable manner. So your users, that means your customers, could be able to easily identify what are those requirements. But in this case, when we talk about system requirement, these requirements are considered according to the developer's perspective, and therefore these requirements are written or are mentioned in a certain way which is more technical than the user requirements, right? For an example, one example is given in your Moodle as well as your pre-described text. I'll take it here. So this is an example given in your pre-described text. I think you remember what is your pre-described text. I'll give that here as well. Right. So here, this first part mentions about user requirement, and this second part represent system requirements. So when you look at these two, you will see that users requirements are given in a manner which is really which is easy to understand by the users or the customers. But here in this second section, these requirements are given with some technical terms. This is like a contract between contract between your client and you, right? So whenever we have this, even if we have user requirements or system requirements, both of these requirements fall under two categories. Those are functional requirements and non-functional requirements. You already know about these types. Functional requirement, and the other kind we have is non-functional requirement. Right? So in functional requirements means what the system will do. All the activities which are involved within the systems are mentioned as functional requirements, and non-functional requirements means the properties of the system. For an example, if we take functional requirement, add items, edit items, delete items, all those things are taken as functional requirements. And when we consider about non-functional requirements, we can think of reliability, efficiency, hardware and software requirements. All those things are non-functional requirements. So here, when we think of functional requirements, we can say that for those function we need to input certain data, and within the function some kind of activities will happen, a process will happen, there's a process involved within that function, and after that some kind of output can be given into the user, right? So in non-functional requirements, those reliability, efficiency, hardware, software requirements can be taken as non-functional requirement. And here we have certain things to be discussed. I'll let you know after discussing about functional requirements, right? So in functional requirements, another thing is there which is to be considered as domain requirements. I'll write it here. So the difference between functional requirements and domain requirement is this domain requirement is a new requirement which is on existing requirement. For an example, assume that you have found a certain activity to do as a function, right? So while you are going to implement that function, when you are implementing that function, you have to think of another certain requirements. An example is given in your pre-described text. It has given that if you think of a train control system, uh, when you create the function of braking system, you will have to think of the weather conditions, right? Your customer may not think of weather conditions and the relationship between weather and the braking system, but as a developer, uh, the developer will have to think of uh, how the braking system should change according to different weather conditions. So once you have think of braking system, another term came into, that means another requirement came up on top of that braking option. So those kind of requirements are called as domain requirements, right? Here in these non-functional requirements, these can be categorized as three other requirements named as product requirements, and organizational requirements, and the last one is external requirements. So product requirements means the requirements which the product should have. For an example, we already discussed about reliability and efficiency. That means the speed. So those are related to product requirements. And when we think of organizational requirements, sometimes different organizations may have standard procedures to be followed. So when you are developing your system, you will have to think of those standard procedures, and you will have to maintain those within your system. So that kind of requirements can also be there, which is known as organizational requirements. And some software have to think of, when you are developing software, sometimes you will have to think of the legal problems, legal bonds which involve with your system. So those kind of things are called as external requirements, right? So now we have discussed about requirements. So all these requirements should be documented somehow, all these things should be documented somehow. So where we do these things is called as SRS. Sorry, SR. Yes. System Requirement Specification Document. So this is a document which we document all the requirements we considered up to now, right? So there are different ways to do that. These requirements contain this document will contain users requirements as well as system requirements, and this will describe what your system will do, right? So usually this has certain things to be included. For an example, these kind of things will be included within a SRS document. That means software requirement specification document. Sorry, system requirement specification document. Uh, First of all, as usual, it will include introduction, and then it will include your functional and non-functional requirements. And then it will include any constraints as well as verification. That means any criteria for accepting your requirements, right? So these kind of things are there in a SRS document. So when you are writing SRS document, you can follow different methods to do that. Write those things like this. So when you are writing SRS, you can select certain types of languages to do that. There are 5 types of languages. I write and explain each of those languages. First one we are going to discuss is natural language. So in this natural language, it is expressed using numbered sentences. So natural language is what we usually speak, right? So we can put some bullets here, numbers, and mention each requirement like this, right? So here we express the requirement using a numbered sentences, right? So in the second option, what we have is the second language we can use is structured language. So when we talk about structured language, this is also written in a natural language, but this has some kind of a format or a standard template. For an example, if I have a form like this, so within this form we can fill the requirements, right? So there's a standard format or standard template to do. Within that template, we use the natural language, right? So that is the difference between natural language and structured language. And the third one we are going to discuss is design description language. As this name implies, this design description language uses a language like a programming language, right? So this kind of languages are rarely used now, because sometimes this will not properly explain what are the requirements are, because we know that when we use programming languages, it is not really easy to understand for some parties. So because of that reason, this design description languages are not widely used now, right? So here what we have is, here we have a format like what we use in programming languages, right? So the other one we have is graphical notation. So this is this notation is easy to understand. You have already done these things. For an example, if you consider a use case, this clearly explains about users and your system requirements and the interaction. That means the association between those two, right? So this kind of graphical representation is called as graphical notation, right? And the final one we are going to mention is mathematical specification. In mathematical specification, we have something like state transition diagrams. Right? So this may not be applicable to each and every system, right? So whenever it's suitable, you can use this option, right? So this is based on mathematical concepts such as finite state machines and sets, right? So that those are the things behind these languages, right? So when you are writing system requirement specification, you can write system requirement specification using these 5 languages. First one we discussed was natural language, which expresses uh, the requirements using numbered sentences. And in structured language, it is written using natural language, but it is according to a standard template or standard format. And this design description language, what it does is it uses a language which is similar to programming languages, but this is rarely used. And in graphical notation, we can express requirements using graphical models. For an example, you can draw UML use cases as well as sequence diagrams. And finally, we discussed about mathematical specification. Here also, we model requirements using mathematical concepts, right? Those concepts can be taken as finite state machines as well as sets. And the last topic we are going to talk about is requirements engineering process, right? So this is the final section we are going to talk about this requirements engineering. As we know, when we have an engineering process, within an engineering process, there are standard set of activities to be done, right? So here also we have standard set of activities to be done. I'll mention all those here. First one we do is requirements elicitation. And then we do requirement analysis. And thereafter we think of requirement validation. And finally, we will have to manage the requirements. So these are the activities involved in requirements engineering process, right? So as I told you before, since this is an engineering process, we have standard set of activities to be followed, and these are those activities, right? So in requirement elicitation, this means discovering the requirements, right? So here you will have to find what are the requirements of your system, right? When you are going to develop a system, there are certain people who involved with that project. So all those people can be taken as stakeholders, right? Remember that term, which is said to be stakeholders. Stakeholders are the groups or individuals who will affect or involve within your project, right? So there can be a number of stakeholders for your system. So you will have to discuss with your stakeholders and gather or discover the requirements which should be completed within your system. So this describes about discovery of requirements. And when you are doing this requirement discovering process, you will have number of problems, because when you're speaking with different stakeholders, sometimes different stakeholders will say different kind of things, right? And the terms or the things they discuss may be mismatch with each other, right? So therefore you will have to consider all those things, and thereafter you will have to analyze and find the correct set of requirements. So for the same place, I'll mention there are certain activities you can carry out to do this requirements elicitation or requirement discovering process. You can observe what the people are doing, and you can interview the people and gather requirements, what kind of things should be done, right? So there are certain methods you can gather requirements, like interviews and like observing real world, real life scenarios, right? So after doing all those stuff, you will have to analyze all those things, and if there are anything, if there are things which mismatches, you will have to clarify all those things and finalize your requirements, right? So analysis part will do those stuff, and then thereafter you will have to validate your requirements. What we mean by validation is, here you will have to think whether the requirements you have gathered are really necessary for the customer, right? So you will have to think, does these requirements really necessary, right? you will have to think of these things. So how you think about these things is you will have to validate those stuff, and you will have to check whether there are conflicts, and you will have to check whether those are complete. And you will have to check whether those are real, and you will have to check whether these can be checked, right? So I'll write those as well, because then you have all those things at the same place, right? This will take a little bit of time, but I'll write those, right? Mm, so when we are doing requirement validation, how we do is we can have, we will have to check validity, and the other term is we will have to check consistency. All these things are given in your LMS, so don't worry. But when you look at this chart or this recap, I think it will be clear to remember. That's why I'm writing. And realism. And right. So validity means in this phase, what we do is we will have to check whether the requirements are valid. That means whether these requirements provide the functionalities which are best fit with the customer's need, right? So validity means you will have to check whether the requirements you have gathered are best matches with your customer's need. And consistency means you will have to check whether there are conflicts. As I told you, at the analysis phase, you may have uh, learned that there are number of mismatched things, number of conflicts, right? So you will have to check whether there are conflicts like that, and you will have to eliminate, or if you have to, you will have to resolve if there are any conflicts, right? Consistent means that thinking of that conflicting, right? So you will have to eliminate any conflicts and then clear uh, your requirements. And completeness means if you do not gather all the requirements that should be implemented within your system, it is a problem, right? Your project will not be a successful one. Therefore, completeness means you will have to check whether you have collected all the requirements uh, while you are gathering requirements, right? And realism means there may be certain problems. That means there can be certain technology related problems, and there can be certain budget related problems. If you have those kind of problems, your system will not be able to really implement, right? So you will have to validate whether the system you are going to develop is a real system, that whether the system you are going to implement can be really implemented, right? And the verifiability means uh, you will have to check whether uh, these requirements can be checked or not. If you can't check whatever the requirements you have, you cannot verify. So verifiability should be there. Whenever you want to check whether this is correct or not, you should be able to do that. This can be done using requirements review, prototyping, and test cases. Well, I'll write those things here. This can be done using requirements reviews and prototyping. and test cases. Right? So you can go through your requirements again from the beginning to end and review all those stuff and check whether these are valid. And you can give a prototype, and then thereafter you can gather other requirements if some certain things are not clarified, and you can use test cases to do that. You can mark input as well as expected outcomes, right? So if expected outcomes are not there, that means you haven't properly gathered those requirements, right? So those are the stuff that comes under requirement validation. Right, and finally, requirement management means managing your requirements, because requirements can be changed time to time, right? So we are in a changing environment. So when we are in a changing requirements, changing environment, requirements also can be changed, because I told you that there are people called as stakeholders. For a project, we have number of stakeholders. When stakeholders change, right, the business process and the way they implement certain things may be different. In that case, you will have to manage the requirements you have already gathered, right? කතා කරේ requirements engineering ගැන. The requirements engineering වලදී අපිට පුළුවන් user ගේ requirements බලන්න සහ system එකේ requirements බලන්න. හරි. ඒතර user ගේ පැත්තෙන් requirements බලනවා කියන්නේ ඒතර user ට පහසු විදියට තමයි user requirements කියන්නේ. එතන user ගේ perspective එක කියන්නේ user ගේ පැත්තෙන් බලනවා නම් මොන වගේ requirements ද කියන්නේ user ට අවශ්‍ය මොන වගේ system එකක්ද කියන එක තමයි user requirements කියන එකෙන් අදහස් කරන්නේ. එතකොට system requirements කියලා අදහස් කරන්නේ user explain කරාට පස්සේ එයාට ඕන සිස්ටම් එක ගැන කිව්වට පස්සේ ඩෙවලොපර් කෙනෙක් විදිහට ඩෙවලොප්මන්ට් ටීම් එකක් විදිහට අපි මොනවද රික්වයර්මන්ට්ස් විදිහට ඉදිරිපත් කරන්න කියලා. ඒතර ඔයගොල්ලන්ගේ ටෙක්ස්ට් බුක් එකේ එක්සැම්පල් එකක් තියෙනවා. ඒක තමයි මම මෙතන ගත්තේ. ඒකේ වෙන් කරලා තියෙනවා මේ පළවෙනි කොටසේ තියෙන යූසර් ගේ රික්වයර්මන්ට් එක, දෙවෙනි කොටසේ තියෙන්නේ සිස්ටම් රික්වයර්මන්ට් එක. එතකොට මේ යූසර් කියන දේ යූසර් කියන විස්තරේ සිස්ටම් රික්වයර්මන්ට් එකක් විදිහට පත් වෙනකොට මේ විදිහට ටිකක් දිගට වැටෙනවා. මොකද යූසර් හැම ටෙක්නිකල් ටර්ම් එකක්ම කියන්නේ නැහැ. හැබැයි යූසර් මොන විදිහට එයා බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන සිස්ටම් එක විස්තර කරත් software එක හදන කෙනා ඒක දිග ඇරලා අවශ්‍ය විදිහට සිස්ටම් එක හැදෙන්න ඕන විදිහට මොනවද requirements කියන එක අඳුර ගන්න ඕනේ. හරි, ඒක නිසා මේ දෙකක් විදිහටයි ගන්නෙ. යූසර් ගේ perspective එක යූසර් බලන විදිහට requirements සහ සිස්ටම් එක පැත්තෙන් තියෙන requirements කියලා කොටස් දෙකක් තියෙනවා. හරි. ඒතර මේ එකතු කරන requirements functional non functional requirements කියලා කොටස් දෙකකට බෙදන්න පුළුවන්. ඔයගොල්ලෝ functional requirements කියන එක සහ non functional requirements කියන එක දන්නවා. functional requirements කොටට ඇතුළත් වෙන්නේ තියෙන activities. හැම activity එකක්ම ඇතුළත් වෙනවා functional requirements කියන කොටට. ඒකේ තව දෙයක් තියෙනවා domain requirement කියලා එකක්. ඒ domain requirement කියලා කියන්නේ මොකක් හරි function එකක් අපි කරන්න යනකොට තව අමතර අවශ්‍යතාවයන් අමතර requirements add වෙනවා නම් අපි ඒකට කියනවා domain requirement එකක් කියලා. උදාහරණයක් විදිහට ඔයගොල්ලන්ගේ ටෙක්ස්ට් බුක් එකේ අරගෙන තියෙනවා train control system එක උදාහරණයක්. ඒතර train control system එකේ හිතන්න ඔයගොල්ලෝ train control system එකක් හදනවා නම් ඒකේ braking system එක හදන්න ඕන. ඒතර braking system එක හදනකොට කස්ටමර්ගේ පැත්තෙන් හිතුවොත් කස්ටමර් කියයි braking system එකක් මට මේකේ තියෙන්න ඕනි කියලා. එතකොට system requirements පැත්තෙන් බලනකොට ඔයගොල්ලන්ටත් braking system එකක් තියෙන්න ඕනි කියලා හිතනවා සහ තව දෙයක් ඔතනට ඇඩ් වෙනවා. ඔයගොල්ලෝ හිතන්න වෙනවා එක එක වෙදර් අවස්ථාවල කියන්නේ කාලගුණ තත්ත්වයන් වෙනස් වෙනකොට බ්‍රේක් කරනකොට ඒක කරන ස්පීඩ් එක කරන විදිහවල් තව කන්ඩිෂන්ස් ඇඩ් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒකට ඒ වගේ අමතර ඇඩ් වෙන රික්වයර්මන්ට්ස් වල තමයි අපි කියන්නේ domain requirements කියලා. ඒකට domain requirements මොකක් හරි දැනට තියෙන requirement එකක් මත තමයි ඇඩ් වෙන්නේ. හරි. ඊළඟට product requirement මෙතන non functional requirements විදිහට අපිට ගන්න පුළුවන්. reliability efficiency ඔයගොල්ලන්ගේ system එක වේගෙන් වැඩ කරනවද reliable ද එතකොට software hardware මොනවා හරි ඕනේද ඒ වගේ දේවල් තමයි non functional requirements කොටට අපි ගන්නෙ එතකොට non functional requirements categorize කරන්න පුළුවන් විදිහවල් තුනක් තියෙනවා product requirement organizational requirements සහ external requirements කියලා. ඒතර product requirements කියන්නේ මම දැන් අර කියපු දේවල්. ඒතර organizational requirements කියලා කියනවා සමහර වෙලාවට එක එක ආයතනවල කරන දේවල් එකම දේ වුණත් ආයතන දෙකක් ගත්තම කරන විදිහ වෙනස් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒත් ඒ කරන පිළිවෙලට අපි අපේ සිස්ටම් එකත් හදන්න වෙනවා. එකම ටාස්ක් එක වුණත් ආයතන දෙකක් ගත්තොත් කරන පිළිවෙල ඕඩර් එක වෙනස් නම් අපි ඒ ඕඩර් එක ආයතනයට ඕන විදිහට තමයි හදන්න ඕනේ. ඒතර organizational requirements කියන්නේ අන්න ඒ වගේ දේවල්. ඒත් සමහරවිට ලීගල් ප්‍රශ්න එන තැන් තියෙනවා. ඒතර සමහර ආයතන වලට ලීගල් ප්‍රශ්න එන්නේ නැහැ. ඒතර ලීගල් කන්සර්න් මොනවත් සිස්ටම් වලට ඇඩ් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. සමහර ඒවාට ඇඩ් වෙනවා. ඒ වගේ දේවල් අපි කියනවා external requirements කියලා. ඒතර මේ එකතු කරන හැම රික්වයර්මන්ට් එකක්ම අපි ඩොකියුමන්ට් කරන්න ඕනේ. ඩොකියුමන්ට් කරන ඩොකියුමන්ට් එකට තමයි අපි කියන්නේ software requirement specification document කියලා. හරි. ඒත් ඔයගොල්ලෝ ප්‍රොජෙක්ට්ස් කරනකොට නම් මේ ඩොකියුමන්ට් එක හදන්නේ නැති වෙයි. ඒ වුණාට සිස්ටම් එකක් ඩෙවලොප් කරනකොට මේ ඩොකියුමන්ට් එකේ තමයි හැම රික්වයර්මන්ට් එකක්ම තියෙන්නේ. හරි requirements in detail තියෙනවා software requirement specification document එකේ. ඒකේ මේ project එකේ requirements ගැන introduction එකක්. එතන functional requirements මොනවද? non functional requirements මොනවද? මොනවා හරි constraints තියෙනවද? එතන verify කරගන්න ඕන දේවල් තියෙනවද? කියන කාරණා ටික මේ document එකේ ඇතුළත් වෙන්න ඕනේ. එතන SRS document එක ලියනකොට අපිට ඒක කරන්න පුළුවන් විදිහවල් කීපයක් තියෙනවා. එතන මේ විදිහවල් ඔක්කොම කරන්නේ නැහැ. අපේ system එකට ගැලපෙනම විදිහට තමයි අපි SRS document එක හදන්නේ. එතකොට කෙනෙක්ට පුළුවන් natural language එක සාමාන්‍යයෙන් අපි කතා කරන language එකකින් මේ විදිහට point form එකකින් ඒ අවශ්‍ය requirements ටික ගැන විස්තර ලියන්න. තව කෙනෙක්ට පුළුවන් තමන් හදාගත්ත format එකකට ඒ requirements ටික ලියලා තියන්න. තව කෙනෙක්ට පුළුවන් programming language අපි අර pseudo code එහෙම ලියන්නේ. pseudo code ලියන pattern එක විදිහට වගේ ලියන්න පුළුවන්. අපේ software requirements document එක. එතකොට තව කෙනෙක්ට පුළුවන් ඔයගොල්ලෝ දැනටමත් කරලා තියෙනා වගේ use case UML diagrams, sequence diagrams වගේ දේවල් හරහා requirements ගැන document කරන්න. ඊට පස්සේ තව කෙනෙක්ට පුළුවන් mathematical specification එකක් විදිහට state machines කියලා තියෙනවා. mathematical states වෙනස් වෙන විදිහ තමයි ඒකේ තියෙන්නේ. ඒතර ඔයගොල්ලෝ දන්නවා sets ගැන. ඒතර ඒ sets විදිහට document කරන්න පුළුවන් requirements. එතකොට මේ ක්‍රම ඔක්කොම පාවිච්චි කරන්න ඕනේ කියලා නැහැ. ගැලපෙන විදිහට තමයි අපේ project එකට ගැලපෙන විදිහට තමයි අපි document කරන්නේ. එතකොට මේ requirement engineering කියන එක engineering process එකක්. අපි සාමාන්‍යයෙන් දන්නවා engineering process එකක් කිව්වම ඕනම engineering task එකක activities කීපයක් තියෙනවා. ඒ activities කීපේ ඒ විදිහට කරගෙන ගියාම තමයි ඒක engineering process එකක් බවට පත් වෙන්නේ. එතකොට requirement elicitation කියලා කියන්නේ අපි requirements එකතු කරන එක හොයාගන්න එක. requirements හොයාගන්නකොට stakeholders වැදගත්. stakeholdersලා කියන්නේ ඔයගොල්ලන්ගේ system එකට join වෙන ඕනම කෙනෙක්. හරි. ඒතර system එක පාවිච්චි කරන අය වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ system එකේ දත් එකතු කරන්න උදව් කරන අය වෙන්න පුළුවන්. expert ඒ ගැන expertsලා වෙන්න පුළුවන්. මේ හැම කෙනෙක්ම අපි stakeholdersලා විදිහට තමයි ගණන් ගන්නේ. stakeholders ලාගෙන් ඔයගොල්ලෝ ප්‍රශ්න කරලා විස්තර දැනගෙන මොනවද සිස්ටම් එකේ තියෙන requirements කියලා එකතු කරගන්න වෙනවා. ඒක කරන්න ඔයගලන්ට interviews පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන්. එහෙම නැත්නම් real life examples ගන්න පුළුවන්. ඒකට බලාගෙන ඉන්න පුළුවන් කොහොමද process එක සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ අපි කියන observation කියලා. ඒ ක්‍රම වලින් ඔයගලන්ට requirements gather කරන්න පුළුවන්. හරි. එකක් මම මෙතන ටග් ගාලා මෙන්ෂන් කරන්නම්. ඒකට ලේසි වෙයි. interviews වලින් ඔයගලන්ට requirements discover කරන කාරණේ කරන්න පුළුවන්. real life examples වලින් ඔයගලන්ට requirements gather කරන කාරණේ කරන්න පුළුවන්. observation ඊළඟට තව ඔයගලන්ට question ayers දෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඔය වගේ දේවල් හරහා ඔයගලන්ට requirement discover කරගන්න පුළුවන්. ඊට මේ discover කරගත්ත requirements වල ප්‍රශ්න තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. මේ තියෙන ප්‍රශ්න ඔක්කොම අපි analyze කරලා බලලා clear කරගන්න ඕනේ. ඒතර clear කරගන්න තැන ඉන්නේ මේ requirement validation කියන අවස්ථාවේදී. එතකොට requirement validation එකේදී අපි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්නේ කස්ටමර්ට අවශ්‍යම දේවල් ටික කරලා දෙන්න. එතකොට කියන්නේ කස්ටමර්ට අනවශ්‍ය දෙයක් කරන්න. එතකොට අපි බලන්න ඕනේ මෙතෙන්දී අපි මේ හදන සිස්ටම් එකේ මේ ලියලා තියෙන requirements අපි හොයාගත්ත requirements ඇත්තටම කස්ටමර්ට ඕන දේවල්ද කියලා. එතකොට අපි ඒ කියන requirements වැලිඩ්ද කියලා බලනවා කියලා කියන්නේ බෙස්ට්ම කස්ටමර්ට හොඳම ෆන්ක්ෂන්ස් ටිකද මෙතන අපි දීලා තියෙන්නේ. ඊට වඩා හොඳ විදිහට අපිට ෆන්ක්ෂන් එක ලබා දෙන්න පුළුවන්ද කියන එක අපි චෙක් කරලා බලනවා වැලිඩිටි එකේදී. එතකොට මොනවා හරි අපහැදිලි තැන් එකට එක අර කොන්ෆ්ලික්ට්ස් කියලා කියන්නේ එකට එකක් පරස්පර අදහස් තියනවාද නොගැලපෙන තැන් තියනවාද කියලා කන්සිස්ටන්සි චෙක් කරනකොට චෙක් කරලා බලනවා. ඊට පස්සේ කම්ප්ලීට්නස් කියලා කියන්නේ අපි සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම අවශ්‍ය දේවල් ටික ගැදා කරාද කියලා බලනවා. එකතු කරාද කියලා බලනවා අවශ්‍ය රික්වයර්මන්ට්ස් ටික. ඊට පස්සේ මේ හොයාගත්ත රික්වයර්මන්ට්ස් අපිට ඇත්තටම ඉම්ප්ලිමන්ට් කරන්න පුළුවන්ද? ඇත්තටම මේ ටික කෝඩ් කරලා හදන්න පුළුවන්ද කියලා චෙක් කරන්න ඕනේ. ඊට පස්සේ මේ ටික ඔක්කොම අපි වෙරිෆයි කරලා බලන්න ඕනේ හරියට සිද්ධ වෙනවද කියලා. ඒතර මේ දේවල් කරන්න අපිට පුළුවන් පාවිච්චි කරන්න requirements review පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන්. කියන්නේ ආපහු රිවිව් කරලා බලන්න පුළුවන්. prototypes පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන්. test cases පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන්.